Sir, are you all right? You're shaking, the man startled, his shoulders jerking as if the words had struck him physically. He pressed himself closer beneath the narrow awning, instinctively retreating into the shallow shelter it offered. Rainwater leaked through a crack above, dripping steadily onto his coat and the pavement near his feet. His breath came out in thin, uneven bursts, betraying the effort it took to stay upright. He blinked hard, clearing rain from his eyes, and finally focused on the source of the voice. A little girl stood just outside the reach of the awning. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face calm but intent. In her hands, she held an old umbrella, its fabric faded, its edges frayed, one of the metal ribs slightly bent. Without saying a word, she stepped closer and tilted the umbrella toward him, angling it so the rain that had been soaking his shoulder slid harmlessly away. "I'm fine," he said automatically. The words came out too fast, too rehearsed. His teeth clicked together once, giving him away. "You shouldn't stop. You'll get wet." The girl didn't move. Instead, she studied him the way children sometimes do, with an honesty adults had learned to hide. "Your hand is hurt," she said. He glanced down, following her gaze. His right hand was tucked awkwardly against his chest, swollen at the knuckles, the skin stretched tight and flushed. The pain pulsed in slow, insistent waves now that he had stopped moving. "It's nothing," he replied, though even he could hear the weakness in the claim. "I slipped. That's all." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small, neatly folded cloth handkerchief. It was thin and worn from use, the corners softened by countless washes. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "You should dry it." He hesitated. Accepting help had never come easily to him, especially from a child. But the rain was cold, and the pain in his hand was beginning to throb more sharply. He took the cloth with his uninjured hand and gently pressed it against the swollen skin. The simple warmth of the gesture steadied him more than he expected. "Thank you," he said quietly. The girl nodded, as if thanks were unnecessary. Then she reached into her pocket again and produced a tiny plastic bottle, its label nearly rubbed blank. "My mom's oil," she explained, "for bumps and falls." Before he could object, she tipped a small amount into her palm and held it up. He stared at her for a second, then slowly extended his injured hand. She rubbed the oil over his knuckles with surprising care, her movements gentle and deliberate. The sharpest edge of the pain dulled, replaced by a warm, soothing ache. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she replied simply, "but I want to." The rain drummed on the umbrella, louder now, more insistent. Water ran along the curb in thin streams, carrying bits of grit and leaves with it. "What's your name?" he asked, mostly to distract himself from the strange tightness in his chest. "Annie," she said. "What's yours?" He paused. Names mattered. They always had. His name carried weight, expectations, consequences. Here, under a leaking awning, soaked and hurting, he didn't want any of that. "Just call me sir," he said at last. Annie frowned slightly but didn't argue. She adjusted her grip on the umbrella again, angling it more firmly over him, even though it left her own sleeve exposed. Rain immediately darkened the fabric. "You should go home," he said. "Your parents will worry." "My mom's waiting for bread," Annie answered. "Dinner doesn't stop because it rains." He nodded. That made sense. Life rarely paused for grief, either. "I can take you to the hospital," Annie said after a moment. "They can look at your hand." He shook his head quickly. "No hospitals. It's just sore. I only need to get something to eat. The bakery's close," she said. "I'm going there." He glanced at the umbrella again, at how small and tired it looked. "Your umbrella's too little for 2 people." "I know," Annie said. "You'll get soaked." She lifted her chin and looked past him at the gray sky. "It's not stopping," she said matter-of-factly. "The rain will keep going." He followed her gaze upward. The clouds were low and heavy, unbroken, the kind that promised no mercy. He looked back at Annie, at the seriousness in her eyes, at his own hand still swollen and tender. "I don't want to take what little you have," he said. Annie stepped closer and tilted the umbrella again, shielding him more fully. "You need it now," she said. I can be wet. Something inside him gave way at that. He looked once more at the sky, then down at the child standing in front of him, offering what protection she could without hesitation. He nodded, just slightly. All right. Annie smiled, small and satisfied. They stepped out from under the awning together. The rain greeted them immediately, soaking Annie's sleeve within seconds, but she didn't complain or slow down. She kept the umbrella angled toward him, her arm straining as they walked quickly toward the bakery. As they moved, the man felt the cold seep into him, but beneath it was something else, something steadier. For the first time since the long, silent hours at the cemetery, since the drive that had ended too abruptly, he felt less alone. He didn't know who Annie was beyond this moment. She didn't know who he was at all, yet there they were, walking side by side in the rain, connected by a small, battered umbrella and an act of kindness that asked for nothing in return. And for now, that was enough. The rain followed them all the way to the bakery, steady and unrelenting, as if the sky had decided to make an example of anyone foolish enough to be outside. The umbrella trembled slightly in Annie's small hand, but she kept it angled toward the man with stubborn determination. He noticed it, of course. He noticed everything now, the way her arm tensed, the way her steps shortened to match his slower pace, the way she leaned just enough to shield him, even when it meant exposing herself. You don't have to walk so slow for me, he said after a few moments. Annie shook her head without looking at him. My mom says when someone's hurt, you don't rush them, you walk with them. He didn't respond right away. The words settled somewhere deep, heavier than they should have been. Walking with someone. He had spent years walking ahead of everyone else, convinced that speed was the same thing as progress. Now, moving carefully beside a child in the rain, he wondered how many times he had mistaken one for the other. If this moment touched you, take a second to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about kindness, justice, and the quiet moments that change lives. The bakery appeared at the corner like a small island of warmth, its front window glowing yellow against the gray street, fogged slightly from the heat inside. The smell reached them before the door did. Bread, yeast, something sweet and familiar. Annie let out a small sigh of relief. There, she said. That's it. He slowed even more as they approached the door. His hand still throbbed, though the oil had helped. Each step sent a dull ache up his arm, but he forced himself not to show it. Pride, he knew, was a reflex. It flared even when it served no purpose. Annie reached for the handle, then hesitated and looked back at him. Can you open it? He smiled faintly. I can manage. He used his uninjured hand to pull the door open. Warm air rushed out to meet them, carrying with it the low murmur of voices and the soft clatter of trays. The sudden change made him sway slightly. Annie noticed immediately. Careful, she said, stepping closer. I'm fine, he replied, though he was beginning to realize that fine had become his most unreliable word. Inside, the bakery was small but busy. A few customers stood near the counter, shaking rain from their coats, talking quietly about the weather as if it were a shared inconvenience rather than a shared reality. The man felt suddenly conspicuous, soaked, pale, standing beside a child with a battered umbrella. He straightened his shoulders out of habit. Annie folded the umbrella carefully and set it by the door, then wiped her hands on her jacket. I need bread, she said. Just one loaf. He nodded. Get what you need. Oaking. She glanced up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. You're hungry too. It wasn't a question. He considered denying it, then stopped himself. Yes, he admitted. I am. Then you should eat, Annie said simply, as if that settled the matter. They moved toward the counter together. The woman behind it smiled at Annie, recognition flickering across her face. Evening, sweetheart. Same as usual? Yes, ma'am, Annie replied. White bread, please, N grade, and a roll for me, the man added before he could overthink it. His voice sounded steadier here, surrounded by warmth and light. The woman's eyes flicked briefly to his damp coat and swollen hand, but she said nothing. She rang up the order and slid the bread across the counter. Annie reached into her pocket and produced a few crumpled bills, smoothing them carefully before handing them over. He watched her do it. The care she took, the seriousness. He reached for his wallet instinctively, then stopped. Something told him that insisting here would break the fragile balance of the moment. "Thank you," Annie said, taking the bread and tucking it under her arm. The woman smiled. "Stay dry out there." They moved to a small standing table near the window. He broke off a piece of the roll and took a cautious bite. The warmth spread through him immediately, easing the hollow ache in his stomach. "Better?" Annie asked. "Yes," he said. "Much." End quote. She nodded, satisfied, and leaned against the table, swinging her legs slightly. Through the window, the rain continued to fall, blurring the street into streaks of gray and gold. "My mom works nights," Annie said suddenly. "At the hospital." He looked at her, surprised by the shift. "That must be hard. She's tired a lot," Annie said. "But she says tired means you're still going." He smiled at that. "She sounds wise." Annie shrugged. "She says a lot of things." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't demand filling. He realized how rare that had become in his life. Silence had always meant waiting for news, for decisions, for outcomes. Here, it was just quiet. A vibration in his pocket broke the spell. He stiffened, then reached for his phone. The screen lit up with his driver's name. He hesitated before answering. Then he slid the phone open and held it to his ear. "Yes? We've got the car running, sir," the driver said, relief evident in his voice. "Where are you?" He glanced at Annie, at the bread under her arm, at the warmth around them. "The bakery on Maple," he replied. "I'm here. We'll be there in a minute." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Annie watched him, curious but quiet. "Your friend?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He fixed the car. She nodded, absorbing that. "That's good. Religsov." "It is," he agreed, though a strange reluctance tugged at him. They finished their food, then stepped back outside together. The rain had softened slightly but hadn't stopped. Annie opened her umbrella again, angling it toward him out of habit. Before either of them could speak, a low, smooth engine sound approached from the street. A black SUV pulled up to the curb and came to a gentle stop in front of them. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out quickly. "Sir," he said, inclining his head with unmistakable respect. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Annie froze. Her gaze moved from the car to the driver, then slowly up to the man beside her. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. He felt it then, the shift, the moment where the world reasserted itself, labels snapping back into place. He turned to Annie and crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." She stared at him, wide-eyed, trying to reconcile the soaked man under the awning with the car now idling beside them. "You're important," she said finally. He smiled, gentle and sad all at once. "Not as much as you think." The driver waited, silent. The rain continued to fall, and Annie stood there, holding her umbrella, realizing that the man she had helped was not who she thought he was at all. The driver held the door open, rain beating on the polished surface of the black SUV. The engine idled quietly, steady and confident, a sound that belonged to a different world than the one Annie knew. She stood rooted to the spot, her fingers tightening around the handle of her umbrella until her knuckles paled. The man straightened slowly. For a moment, he did not move toward the car. He seemed reluctant, as if crossing the few feet between the sidewalk and the door meant stepping out of something fragile and rare. "Sir," the driver said again, softer this time, "it's pouring. You should get inside." He nodded, but before he did, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Annie watched him closely now, her eyes following every movement. He pulled out a clean handkerchief, thicker than the one she had given him, and held it out to her. "For your umbrella," he said, "and your sleeve." Annie hesitated. "I'm okay." "I know," he replied, "but take it anyway." She accepted it, slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too fast. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above the rain. He crouched again, lowering himself so they were face to face. Up close, she could see lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was smiling inside the bakery. They weren't lines of age so much as lines of use, carved by long hours and longer silences. "You did a good thing today," he said. Annie frowned. "I just helped," he nodded. "That's usually how good things start." The driver cleared his throat discreetly, glancing at the sky. The rain showed no sign of letting up. The man rose and turned toward the car. As he did, Annie blurted out, "Wait." He stopped and looked back. "You didn't tell me your name," she said. He considered her for a moment. The easy thing would have been to give it now, to let the truth land cleanly and quickly. But something in her expression, open, unguarded, made him pause. "My name won't help you," he said gently. "But if we meet again, I promise I'll tell you." Annie studied him, weighing the promise with the seriousness only a child could muster. Then she nodded. "Okay." He stepped into the SUV. The driver closed the door, sealing him inside a cocoon of warmth and quiet. Through the tinted window, he watched Annie retreat a step, her small figure framed by rain and streetlight. As the car pulled away, Annie remained on the sidewalk, umbrella tilted uselessly now that there was no one else to shield. She watched the taillights disappear down the street, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She had helped a man, a hurt man, an important man. She didn't know what that meant yet, only that her chest felt tight in a way she couldn't name. Inside the SUV, the man leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. The warmth seeped into him slowly, but it didn't bring relief the way it should have. Instead, his thoughts replayed the last hour with unsettling clarity. The awning, the pain in his hand, the small voice asking if he was all right. "Hospital?" the driver asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He shook his head. "No, home." The driver hesitated. "Your hand, it's fine," he said, then corrected himself. "It can wait." They drove in silence for several minutes, the city sliding past in wet streaks of light. His phone buzzed again, this time with messages he didn't open. Board members, advisors, people who expected answers. He flexed his fingers slowly. The swelling had gone down a little, but the ache remained, a reminder he welcomed more than he should have. Pain was honest. It didn't flatter. It didn't pretend. "Stop the car," he said suddenly. The driver looked startled. "Sir." At the next light, the SUV slowed and pulled to the curb. He opened the door before the driver could protest and stepped back out into the rain. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and bracing. "What are you doing?" the driver asked, alarmed. "Go back," he said. "To the bakery. Find the girl." The driver blinked. "The child?" "Yes, Annie." He hadn't realized he had memorized her name until he said it aloud. "I want you to give her this," he continued, pulling his wallet out again. He removed a card plain, unassuming, and scribbled something on the back. Then he slipped it into an envelope he kept tucked inside the car door. "Not money," he added quickly, as the driver glanced at the wallet. "Just this. And make sure she gets home dry." The driver nodded slowly. "Of course." The man watched the car disappear in the opposite direction this time, rain soaking into his coat once more. He stood there alone, on a street corner, feeling the weight of the day settle fully onto his shoulders. For the first time since the cemetery, since the quiet goodbye he had never finished, he felt something stir beneath the grief. Responsibility. Not the kind written into contracts or measured in numbers, but the kind that arrived uninvited, carried by a child's steady hands and an umbrella that was too small. He hailed another car and gave his address. As it drove on, he stared out at the rain-slicked streets, his reflection ghosting in the glass. Justice, he thought, wasn't always fair, but kindness didn't ask permission. Across town, Annie reached her building and climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment. Her mother looked up from the kitchen, worry etched into her tired face. "You're soaked," she said. "What happened?" Annie set the bread on the counter and shrugged out of her jacket. It rained. Her mother sighed and reached for a towel. "You okay?" Annie nodded. Then, after a moment, she said, "Mom?" "Yes, baby." Helping someone change things?" Her mother paused, studying her daughter's face. "Sometimes," she said carefully. "Why?" Annie thought of the man's eyes, the way he had looked at her when he said thank you. I think it already did. Her mother smiled faintly and pulled her into a hug. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, carrying with it the quiet beginnings of something neither of them could yet see. Morning came quietly, as if the rain had wrung all the noise out of the night before. Annie woke to the familiar hum of the radiator and the smell of toast burning just a little at the edges. She lay still for a moment, staring at the crack in the ceiling that looked like a crooked river, trying to decide whether the night before had been a dream. It hadn't been. Her jacket was still hanging over the chair, damp at the cuffs. The old umbrella leaned against the wall, its fabric darker where the rain had soaked through, and tucked carefully beneath it, folded the way grown-ups folded important things, was a thick white handkerchief that didn't belong to them. "Annie," her mother called from the kitchen. "You're going to be late." "I'm up," Annie said, sliding out of bed. She padded into the kitchen, still thinking about the man's eyes when the black car had pulled up, the way the street had seemed to pause, the way everything she thought she understood had shifted without warning. Her mother stood at the counter in her scrubs, hair pulled back tight, eyes already tired. She glanced at Annie's jacket. "You really got caught in it last night." Annie nodded. "I helped someone." Her mother smiled faintly, distracted. "You always do." Annie opened her mouth to explain, then closed it again. Some things felt too big to say out loud yet. Instead, she climbed onto the chair and ate her toast, quiet and thoughtful. On the street below, the neighborhood moved at its usual pace. People heading to work, kids with backpacks, the same cracked sidewalk, the same bus that wheezed when it stopped. Nothing looked different. And yet Annie felt as though she were carrying something new inside her, something she didn't quite know how to hold. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, washed-out blue. The puddles left behind by the storm reflected broken pieces of buildings and passing feet. Annie was sitting on the stoop, drawing circles in the chalk dust with the toe of her sneaker, when a car she had never seen before slowed in front of the building. It wasn't as big as the one from last night, but it was still too clean, too quiet for the street. A man stepped out, not young, not old, wearing a dark coat and an expression that didn't quite belong here. He looked around, then spotted Annie. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you Annie?" Her stomach fluttered. She stood up slowly. "Yes, I'm looking for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Someone asked me to give you this." She took it with both hands, careful not to crease it. The envelope was heavy for its size. "Who?" The man smiled, but there was a practiced distance in it. "A friend." He waited, as if expecting her to open it right there. Annie didn't. She just nodded. "Did you get home safe last night?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "My mom was there." "Good," he replied. He hesitated, then added, he wanted to make sure. Before she could ask anything else, the man tipped his head politely and returned to the car. It pulled away without hurry, leaving Annie standing on the stoop with the envelope pressed to her chest. Inside, she opened it slowly. There was a card, plain and white, with a number written neatly on the back and a short line beneath it. "If you ever need help, call." No name, no title, just that. She didn't know why her eyes stung, but they did. She folded the card and slipped it into the pocket of her jacket, the same pocket where she kept the little bottle of oil. Across town, the man sat in a quiet office overlooking a river that had once powered factories and now reflected glass towers. His coat hung neatly on the back of a chair. His hand was wrapped, properly this time, though he barely noticed it. "Cancel the afternoon," he said, into the phone. "I'll reschedule." There was a pause, then a cautious voice. "Sir, the board." "I know," he said. "They can wait." He ended the call and leaned back, staring out the window. The city looked orderly from up here, predictable. He had built his life on that view, on the belief that distance brought clarity. He thought of a different view: rain-streaked pavement, a broken awning, a child angling an umbrella that was too small. He thought of how easily he could have walked past himself last night, how many times he already had. Justice, he reflected, was often discussed in rooms like this one, defined, debated, filed away. But kindness didn't live here. It showed up uninvited, wearing worn shoes and asking no questions. He stood and moved toward the window, pressing his uninjured hand against the glass. For years, he had believed that doing good required power, resources, control. Now he wasn't so sure. Back on her street, Annie helped an older neighbor carry groceries up the steps. She didn't mention the envelope or the card. She didn't mention the car or the man. She just did what she always did. But when the neighbor thanked her, Annie felt something steady and warm settle in her chest. Somewhere between the rain and the morning light, something had been set in motion. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself, but it was real. The bakery reopened that afternoon with the same soft chime of its bell. The same smell of bread settling into the street as if nothing out of the ordinary had ever passed through its door. Annie noticed it on her way back from school, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. She slowed for a moment, glancing at the window, half expecting to see the man standing there again, rain-soaked and quiet. He wasn't. She told herself that made sense. Important people didn't linger in small places. They passed through them, briefly, like storms. Still, she touched the pocket of her jacket where the card rested, just to be sure it was there. At home, her mother slept. The night shift always took more out of her than she admitted, and Annie had learned to move quietly on afternoons like this. She put her backpack away, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the small kitchen table with her crayons and a scrap of paper. She tried to draw the umbrella. It came out crooked, the handle too long, the fabric uneven. She frowned and tried again. This time, she drew the man too tall, slightly bent, his hand held close to his chest. She added the rain as lines slanting across the page, heavy and insistent. When she finished, she folded the paper and slipped it into her backpack. She didn't know why. It just felt like something worth keeping. Across the city, the man sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. 12 people faced him, their expressions attentive, cautious. A screen behind him glowed with numbers and projections, the language of certainty he had spoken fluently for years. He listened. He always did. He listened as they discussed timelines, returns, risk mitigation. He nodded at the appropriate moments. He asked the questions they expected him to ask, but his mind kept drifting back to a quieter voice. "Sir, are you all right?" He flexed his injured hand beneath the table. The swelling had gone down, but it still ached, especially when he ignored it. He let it ache. It kept him anchored. "We'll need a decision by Friday," one of the board members said. "Delaying will cost us leverage." The man looked up. "Cost whom?" There was a pause. A few exchanged glances. "Us," someone said carefully. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. Good 9. After the meeting ended, he remained seated while the others filed out, murmuring into phones, already shifting to the next urgency. He stared at the blank screen until it dimmed, then stood and walked to the window. From this height, the city looked manageable. Patterns revealed themselves. Problems shrank. He had once believed this view gave him perspective. Now he wasn't so sure. His assistant knocked lightly on the open door. "Sir, your driver's ready." He nodded. "Thank you." 7. As the car moved through traffic, he watched people hurry along sidewalks. Heads down, shoulders hunched against the lingering damp. He wondered how many of them were hurting in ways no one noticed. How many were waiting under broken awnings, hoping someone would look up. That evening, Annie sat on the stoop with her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who liked to tell stories about the neighborhood when it had been louder, fuller, before rents rose and families moved on. "You know, Mrs. Alvarez said, adjusting her sweater, this street used to look out for its own. People stopped when someone fell. They shared what little they had." "What happened?" Annie asked. Mrs. Alvarez smiled sadly. "People got busy. Busy makes you blind." Annie thought of the rain, of all the feet that had passed by the man without slowing. "I don't want to be busy like that," she said. Mrs. Alvarez patted her knee. "Then don't be." "Oh." The simplicity of the answer stayed with Annie long after the sun dipped below the buildings. Later that night, the man stood in his kitchen, staring at the refrigerator without really seeing it. He hadn't been hungry all day. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, the quiet pressing in around him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief Annie had given him. It was clean now, washed and folded, but the faint scent of oil still lingered. He held it for a moment, then placed it carefully in a drawer he rarely used. He thought of the envelope he had sent, of the card without a name. It wasn't generosity, he knew. Not really. It was caution. He didn't trust himself yet. Didn't trust the impulse that had taken hold of him since the rain. But impulses could become intentions. Intentions could become actions. The next morning, Annie walked to school under a sky that threatened rain but didn't deliver. She passed the same corner where the awning stood, its crack still visible. She paused, just for a second, then continued on. Behind her, the city moved forward, unaware that something small had shifted. Neither of them knew it yet, but the rain had done more than soak clothes and streets. It had drawn a line between who they had been before and who they might become next. The rain returned 3 days later, lighter this time but persistent, as if the sky hadn't finished saying what it needed to say. Annie noticed it on her walk home from school, the way the air smelled damp before the first drops even touched the pavement. She pulled her jacket tighter and quickened her steps, her mind drifting back to the night under the awning without her meaning to. She didn't talk about the man much, not at school, not even to her mother, beyond a few simple sentences. Some stories felt safer when they were held close, protected from too many questions. That evening, her mother sat at the small kitchen table sorting through mail, her brow furrowed in concentration. Bills, mostly. Annie watched from the doorway, recognizing the look. It was the same look her mother wore when she thought Annie wasn't paying attention. "Mom," Annie said. "Yes, baby. If someone helps you, does that mean you owe them?" Her mother paused, envelope halfway open. She leaned back in her chair and considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "Not if it was given freely." Annie nodded, absorbing that. "What if they don't ask for anything?" Her mother smiled faintly. "Then maybe the best way to pay them back is to help someone else when you can." That made sense. Annie felt a small, quiet relief she hadn't known she was holding. Across town, the man stood in a narrow hallway outside a private medical office, his injured hand wrapped neatly, his expression unreadable. He hadn't wanted to come. He disliked waiting rooms, disliked the way time seemed to stretch and compress at random inside them. But the dull ache had refused to fade, and ignoring it felt irresponsible now in a way it hadn't before. The doctor was brisk, efficient. "You were lucky," she said, adjusting the wrap. "No fracture. Severe bruising. You should have come in sooner." He nodded. "I know. Try resting it," she added, not bothering to hide her skepticism. "And avoid unnecessary strain." Unnecessary. He almost smiled at that. When he stepped back out onto the street, the rain had picked up, tapping lightly against his coat. He stood there for a moment, watching people hurry past, umbrellas blooming and folding like dark flowers. He wondered, briefly, how many of them would stop if someone fell in front of them. He wondered how many times he hadn't. The next day, Annie's class was assigned a project about community. The teacher asked them to draw or write about someone who made their neighborhood better. While the other children talked excitedly about firefighters and store owners, Annie sat quietly, her pencil hovering over the paper. She drew an umbrella. Under it, she drew 2 figures, one tall, one small. She didn't add faces. She didn't need to. When the teacher came by and asked her to explain, Annie shrugged. "It's someone who needed help," she said. "And someone who helped." "That's very nice," the teacher replied. "Do they have names?" Annie shook her head. "Not everyone needs one." That night, the man sat at his desk long after the lights in most of the building had gone out. The city outside was quiet, softened by mist. A file lay open in front of him, its contents familiar and suddenly unsettling. Addresses, zoning changes, timelines, entire blocks reduced to line items. He closed the file slowly. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely called himself. "I want a report," he said when the line connected, "on the Maple Street redevelopment. Full impact. Families, schools, everything." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, that project's all ready." I know, he said. Just get me the report. He ended the call and leaned back, rubbing his temples. He didn't know what he was going to do with the information yet. He only knew he couldn't unsee certain things once they were seen. Annie lay in bed later, listening to the rain against the window. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the card again, tracing the numbers with her finger. She didn't plan to call. She just liked knowing it was there. In the quiet, she remembered the man's eyes when he'd looked up at the sky, the way he'd nodded as if agreeing to something he hadn't wanted to accept. She wondered where he was now. If his hand still hurt, if he was dry, she hoped he was. The following afternoon, the bakery owner taped a small sign to the window. Help wanted. Annie noticed it as she passed by with her mother. The owner smiled at them and waved. Business picking up? Her mother asked. Something like that, the woman replied, glancing at the sign. People seem a little kinder lately. Annie didn't say anything, but she felt a small warmth bloom in her chest. That night, the man stood on his balcony, rain misting the air, city lights blurring below. He held his phone loosely in his hand, the number he hadn't used hovering on the screen. He didn't call, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something like patience, like the understanding that some things needed time to grow, quietly, out of sight. Below, the rain continued to fall, stitching the city together with thin silver lines. The report arrived the next morning, thick and meticulously organized, its pages heavy with the kind of information most people never saw until it was too late. The man read it alone in his office, the door closed, the city muted behind glass, addresses blurred into statistics, schools into footnotes, families into projections. He stopped when he reached Maple Street, the bakery, the corner, the awning. He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and closed his eyes. For years, he had trained himself to read documents like this without emotion, to separate impact from intention. But now the separation refused to hold. Faces intruded where numbers should have been. A small girl with a frayed umbrella, a mother working nights, a neighborhood already stretched thin. He picked up the phone again. Put the Maple Street project on hold, he said when his assistant answered. There was a pause. Sir, that will cause delays. Yes, he replied calmly. It will. Taxi. He ended the call before objections could form. His hand throbbed faintly as he rested it on the desk. A reminder that decisions, like falls, left marks. Across town, Annie was learning long division and thinking about none of it. Her pencil scratched across the page as she worked carefully. Tongue pressed against her lip in concentration. When she finished, she raised her hand. Yes, Annie? The teacher asked. Can you change your mind about something important? Annie said. The class laughed softly. The teacher smiled. Of course you can, she said. That's how people grow. Annie nodded, satisfied, and returned to her work. After school, she walked home with her friend Marcus, who kicked at a crushed soda can as they went. My mom says they're going to tear down some buildings near Maple, he said. Build fancy stuff. Annie felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. When? Marcus shrugged. Soon, I think. Oh, she didn't say anything else. But when they parted ways, she took a longer route home, passing the bakery again. The help wanted sign was still there. Inside, the owner wiped down the counter, her movements brisk but tired. Annie stood outside for a moment, then pushed the door open. The bell chimed. Hi, she said. The woman looked up and smiled. Hey, sweetheart, do you need help? Annie asked, nodding toward the sign. The woman laughed gently. You're a bit young for the job. I can sweep, Annie said. After school, the woman considered her, then softened. That's kind of you. But school's your job, Annie nodded, though she felt a pang of disappointment. As she turned to leave, the woman added, Tell you what, you come by sometimes, keep me company. That helps more than you think. Annie smiled. Okay. That evening, the man found himself driving without a destination. He told the driver to take a longer route home, then longer still. The city unfolded beneath them, block by block, less polished the farther they went. He rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool air in. Stop here, he said suddenly. The driver obeyed, pulling over near a row of modest buildings. The man stepped out and stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking around. This was Maple Street. In daylight, it looked smaller, more vulnerable. He walked past the bakery, past the awning. The crack was still there, dark against the concrete. He reached out and touched it briefly, as if confirming it was real. A woman carrying groceries glanced at him, wary. He nodded politely and stepped aside to let her pass. She relaxed slightly, surprised. For the first time in years, he felt like a visitor in his own city. At home later, Annie sat at the kitchen table doing homework while her mother cooked. "Mom," she said, "what happens if people have to move?" Her mother paused. "Sometimes they go somewhere else," she said carefully. "Sometimes they fight to stay." "Is it fair?" Annie asked. Her mother sighed. "Fair isn't always how things work." Annie thought of the man's words. "Not as much as you think." She wondered if he knew how unfair things were down here, away from tall buildings and clean windows. The next day, a letter arrived at the bakery addressed to the owner. She opened it slowly, frowning as she read. Then she read it again. "Annie," she called when the girl stopped by that afternoon. "Come here." Quote sound. Annie approached, heart pounding. "Yes?" The woman held up the letter. "They're postponing the redevelopment. No timeline. No notice." Annie blinked. "That's good, right?" The woman nodded, still stunned. "It is. It really is." Annie didn't cheer. She didn't jump. She just felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest, the same feeling she had felt under the umbrella. That night, the man stood once more on his balcony. The city spread out before him. He knew the hold was temporary. He knew pressure would come. He also knew he couldn't go back to not knowing. He pulled the card from his pocket, the one he had written his number on before sending it away. He stared at the blank space where his name should have been. Justice, he thought again, was rarely clean. It came in fragments, in pauses, in decisions made quietly, without applause. Below, the city moved on, unaware of the small hinge it had just turned on. The meeting was supposed to be routine. That was what everyone believed when they filed into the glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor. Coffee cups were set down. Tablets were opened. Familiar faces took familiar seats. The city lay beneath them, distant and orderly, as if it existed purely for presentation. The man took his place at the head of the table without ceremony. His injured hand rested on the polished surface, wrapped but no longer hidden. He did not miss the way a few eyes flicked toward it, then away. "Before we begin," one of the senior partners said, adjusting his glasses, "we need to address the Maple Street delay." The man nodded once. "Yes, we do." A pause followed. It was subtle, but charged. Maple Street was not supposed to take this much oxygen from the room. It was a small project by their standards, barely worth a footnote in quarterly reports. "Postponing sends the wrong signal," another voice said. "We've already committed resources. We've committed assumptions," the man replied calmly. "There's a difference." He reached for the report and slid it across the table. "I want everyone to read page 14. A few people exchanged looks but complied. Pages turned. The room grew quieter. "These aren't just numbers," he continued. "They're families, schools, businesses that have been there longer than we have. It is while. With respect," the partner with the glasses said, "our responsibility is to shareholders." The man met his gaze. "Our responsibility is to consequences." That landed heavier than he expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, someone said, "This isn't like you." He nodded. "I know." Across town, Annie sat on the floor of the bakery with a broom that was almost as tall as she was. The owner had relented after all, deciding that a little sweeping couldn't hurt. Annie worked carefully, pushing crumbs into neat piles, humming softly to herself. "You don't have to do that so seriously," the woman said, amused. Annie looked up. "If you don't do it right, you have to do it again." The woman smiled. "That's true." When Annie finished, she washed her hands and sat at the counter with a small cookie the woman slipped her. Through the window, she watched people pass. Some hurried, Some lingered. Some looked tired in a way she recognized. "Miss?" Annie asked suddenly. "Yes? Why do grown-ups stop seeing things?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Like, they don't see people anymore. Just where they're going." The woman leaned on the counter. "Because seeing takes time," she said. "And time feels expensive when you're older." Annie thought about that. "But helping doesn't take that long." "No," the woman agreed quietly. "It doesn't. I progress." Back in the conference room, the discussion grew sharper. Words like liability and precedent floated through the air, polished and precise. The man listened without interrupting, letting the arguments stack themselves neatly. When they finished, he spoke. "We're not canceling Maple Street," he said. "We're reworking it. With community input. With protections. That will reduce margins," someone said. "Yes. And if residents refuse, then we listen." Silence fell again. This time, it wasn't confused. It was wary. "You're asking us to slow down," the partner said. "I'm asking us to look," the man replied. The vote was close. Closer than he would have liked. But when it was over, the decision stood. Maple Street would wait. When he left the building, the city felt different. Not smaller, not kinder, just more present. He told the driver to take Maple Street again. This time, he didn't stop at the awning. He walked. He passed the bakery and noticed Annie inside, sweeping with intense concentration. He didn't go in. He didn't wave. He kept walking, letting the moment be what it was. Not everything needed to be acknowledged to matter. That evening, Annie sat at the kitchen table coloring while her mother filled out forms. The television murmured softly in the background. "Mom," Annie said. "What's a shareholder?" Her mother laughed lightly. "Someone who owns a piece of something." Tensions. Do they get to decide everything? Her mother hesitated. "They get to decide a lot." Annie frowned. "Even if they don't live there?" Her mother set the pen down. "Sometimes." "That's weird," Annie said. "They don't know the people." Her mother studied her daughter for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. It is weird." Later that night, the man stood at his desk, looking at a framed photograph he hadn't moved in years. It was of him and his wife, laughing on a beach, hair whipped by the wind, a life before margins and meetings. He touched the frame lightly. "I didn't see it," he said softly to the empty room. "I'm starting to." He picked up his phone and typed a message he didn't send. "Not yet." Some bridges needed stronger footing before you crossed them. Outside, the rain began again, light and steady, tapping against the windows as if reminding the city that nothing stayed dry forever. On Maple Street, Annie opened her window just enough to smell it. She smiled to herself and went back to her coloring, unaware that far above her, decisions were being made that echoed something she already knew. Seeing didn't take long. It just took choosing to stop. The first knock came just after sunset. Annie was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting her crayons by color the way she liked to do when she was thinking. Her mother was in the kitchen, the radio low, a pot simmering on the stove. When the knock sounded, sharp and unfamiliar, they both looked up. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel. "Did you invite someone over?" Annie shook her head. The knock came again, firmer this time. Her mother walked to the door cautiously and opened it just enough to see who stood on the other side. A man in a pressed jacket waited there, holding a clipboard against his chest. He smiled politely, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening," he said. "I'm with the city housing office." Annie's stomach tightened. "We sent notices last month," the man continued, glancing down at his clipboard. "About the upcoming review of this building." Her mother stiffened. "We haven't received anything new." "This is just a follow-up," he said smoothly. "Routine. We'll need to schedule an inspection." Annie stood slowly and moved closer, her small hand slipping into her mother's. She felt the tension travel through her mother's fingers. "When?" her mother asked. "Soon," the man replied. "We'll be in touch." He tipped his head, turned, and walked down the stairs without waiting for a response. The door closed softly, but the quiet that followed was heavier than any slam. "What does that mean?" Annie asked. Her mother knelt in front of her and brushed a curl back from her face. "It means we might have to answer some questions." she said carefully. That's all. But Annie had learned to hear the space between words. That night, the man sat in his study with the Maple Street file open again. Though he had promised himself he wouldn't read it before bed, he hadn't expected to see new annotations already added in the margins, comments from city officials, notes about inspections and compliance. He frowned. This is moving too fast, he muttered. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had used earlier that day. I need clarification, he said when the line connected. Why are inspections being scheduled while the project is on hold? A pause. Then, standard procedure, sir. Not when I've requested a freeze, he replied. Pause them. Very. There was hesitation on the other end this time. That may not be entirely within our control. He ended the call without responding, jaw tightening. Control was a word people liked to use when it suited them. Responsibility. Less so. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere below, on a street he now knew by name, a family was trying to sleep without knowing what questions tomorrow might bring. Justice, he thought again, wasn't just about decisions. It was about timing. About who had the luxury to wait and who didn't. The next day at school, Annie found it hard to concentrate. The numbers on the page blurred together, slipping away from her as soon as she tried to hold them. When the teacher called on her, she blinked, startled, then answered correctly anyway. That seemed to worry the teacher more than if she'd gotten it wrong. During recess, Marcus kicked at the fence again, harder this time. My mom's mad, he said. She says people are coming to look at our place. Annie's chest tightened. Ours too. They stood in silence, watching the other kids run. Do you think they'll make us leave? Marcus asked. I don't know, Annie said honestly. That afternoon, Annie stopped by the bakery again. The owner was on the phone, her voice low and tense. When she hung up, she sighed and rubbed her temples. Everything okay? Annie asked. The woman hesitated, then smiled weakly. They're asking questions. About what? About whether this place fits the future. Annie frowned. It does. The woman laughed softly. I think so too. That night, Annie took the card out of her jacket pocket and held it in both hands. She had promised herself she wouldn't use it unless she had to. She wasn't sure what had to meant, but the knot in her stomach told her this might be close. She looked at her mother, asleep on the couch in her scrubs, exhaustion written into every line of her body. Annie went into her room, closed the door quietly, and sat on her bed. She stared at the number for a long time. Her finger hovered, then she pressed call. Across the city, the man's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He frowned, checking the screen. An unknown number. He considered ignoring it. Then something, a memory of rain, of a small voice made him answer. Hello? There was silence at first. Then, softly, It's Annie. He sat up immediately. Annie? Are you all right? Yes, she said quickly. I think so. His chest tightened. What's wrong? They came to our building, she said. A man with papers. My mom says it's nothing, but it feels like something. He closed his eyes briefly. Thank you for calling me. I didn't know who else to tell, she admitted.
Hello.
You did the right thing, he said. Listen to me, okay? You and your mom are not in trouble. No one is going to make you leave tonight. Promise? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Promises mattered. I promise I will do everything I can, he said carefully. And I don't make that promise lightly. There was a small exhale on the other end of the line. Okay. Can you tell your mom someone called and asked questions? He continued. Just questions. Nothing scary. I can do that, Annie said. They were quiet for a moment, neither quite ready to hang up. Thank you for the umbrella, he said finally. Annie smiled, though he couldn't see it. You're welcome. When the call ended, the man was already reaching for his jacket. Some decisions didn't belong in conference rooms. Some belonged on streets like Maple. The city looked different at night when you drove through it with a purpose. The man sat in the back seat of the SUV, his phone pressed to his ear, listening more than speaking as the driver navigated toward Maple Street. Streetlights passed in steady rhythm, illuminating blocks that rarely made it into reports or presentations. He recognized them now, the uneven sidewalks, the patched brick, the small storefronts holding on through habit and hope. Yes, he said quietly into the phone. I want everything paused. Inspections, notices, all of it. A voice on the other end hesitated. Sir, the city operates independently. We can request. I'm not requesting, he replied, his tone calm but firm. I'm taking responsibility. If there's pressure, it comes to me. Silence followed, then a reluctant acknowledgement. He ended the call and leaned back, exhaling slowly. You sure about this? The driver asked, eyes flicking up in the mirror. No, the man said honestly, but I'm sure about not ignoring it. They turned onto Maple Street. The buildings were quiet, their windows glowing softly in places, televisions flickering behind thin curtains. This wasn't a street that slept deeply. It rested lightly, always half aware that something could be taken away. Pull over here, he said. The SUV stopped near the bakery. The awning loomed above the sidewalk, its cracks still visible, darkened by old rain. He stepped out into the cool air, jacket collar turned up, and stood for a moment, just looking. Annie's building was a few doors down. Inside, Annie sat on the edge of her bed, her phone clutched in both hands even though the call had ended minutes ago. Her heart still beat faster than normal. She listened to the sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, her mother's steady breathing from the couch. Everything looked the same. That was the strange part. She padded quietly into the living room and pulled a blanket up over her mother's shoulders. Then she sat on the floor, back against the couch, and waited without knowing for what. A knock came at the door. Her mother stirred. Annie, I'll get it, Annie whispered. She stood, hesitated, then walked to the door and opened it just enough to see who stood outside. It was him, not the man from the rain. Exactly this version stood straighter, his coat dry, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes were the same. Tired, intent. Hi, Annie said softly. Hi, he replied. Is your mom awake? She's tired, Annie said. She worked last night. He nodded. May I speak with her? Just for a minute. Annie bit her lip, then opened the door wider. Mom, she called gently. Someone's here. Her mother sat up, confusion flashing across her face before she registered the stranger standing in their doorway. Instinctively, she straightened, smoothing her scrubs. Yes, she said, guarded. My name is Daniel, he said, choosing it deliberately. I'm sorry to come so late. I wanted to speak with you about the inspection notices. Her posture stiffened. Are you from the city? No, he replied. But I'm someone who can stop them from moving forward. She studied him closely now. Why? He glanced at Annie, then back at her mother. Because this building matters. And because your daughter called me. I do. Her mother looked down at Annie, surprise and something like fear crossing her face. You called him? Annie nodded. I didn't know who else. The silence that followed was tense, but not angry. Finally, her mother gestured toward the small kitchen table. Sit, she said. Explain. Daniel sat, folding his hands carefully, aware of how large he must look in the small space. He spoke plainly, about the redevelopment, about the hold, about the pressure that didn't always stop just because someone asked it to. I can't promise nothing will ever change, he said. But I can promise this: no one will be forced out without notice, without options, without a voice. Her mother listened, arms crossed, eyes sharp. And why are you doing this? He met her gaze. Because someone reminded me what it looks like when people are invisible. Annie watched her mother's expression soften just slightly. Not trust, not yet, but consideration. You don't owe us anything, her mother said. I know, he replied. That's why I'm here. They talked for another 10 minutes. About work, about school, about the bakery. Nothing dramatic, just details, human ones. When he stood to leave, Annie walked him to the door. Thank you, she said. He smiled. You're welcome. And Annie? Yes, you did exactly what you should have done. After he left, Annie's mother sat quietly for a long time. You were brave, she said finally. Annie shrugged. I was scared. That's usually when brave happens, her mother replied. Down on the street, Daniel paused beneath the awning. He looked up at the crack, at the place where rain still gathered when storms came hard enough. Justice, he thought, wasn't a grand reveal. It was a series of interruptions, small ones, timely ones. As he returned to the car, his phone buzzed again. Another call, another problem waiting. This time, he answered with certainty. "Not this one," he said. "This street stays." The next morning, Maple Street woke up uneasy. The usual sounds were there, the bus coughing to a stop, the bakery door chiming open, a radio playing somewhere behind a half-open window, but underneath it all ran a thin current of tension. People spoke more quietly. They lingered longer at doorways. News traveled fast here, and it rarely came alone. Annie felt it as soon as she stepped outside. Mrs. Alvarez was already on the stoop across the street. Her sweater pulled tight despite the mild air. She waved Annie over with 2 fingers. "Your mama home?" she asked. "She's sleeping," Annie said. "She worked late." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "Figures. Listen, you hear anything about the inspections?" Annie hesitated, then shook her head. "Just that they were coming," Mrs. Alvarez sighed. "That's what they always say before they do." Annie looked down at her sneakers, scuffing the toe against the concrete. She wanted to say something reassuring, something certain, but certainty was a big thing to carry at 6 years old. At the end of the block, 2 men stood near a city truck, talking in low voices. One of them held a clipboard. Heads turned toward them as people passed, eyes lingering just a second too long. Annie felt her stomach tighten. Inside the bakery, the owner was quieter than usual. She poured coffee she didn't drink and wiped a counter that was already clean. "They coming today?" Annie asked. The woman shrugged. "That's what the rumor says." Annie climbed onto a stool and folded her hands in her lap. "If they come," she said carefully, "do you have to leave?" The woman looked at her, really looked at her, and smiled without humor. "Not today," she said. "But that's how it always starts. With today." Thank you for watching. Across the city, Daniel sat at a long table with 3 people who were not used to being summoned on short notice. The room wasn't the one with glass walls and skyline views. This one was smaller, older, lined with shelves instead of windows. "You can't just freeze municipal processes," one of the men said, irritation barely contained. "There are protocols." "I know," Daniel replied evenly. "I've read them." "Then you know there are limits to influence," another added. Daniel folded his hands, feeling the familiar weight of resistance settle in. "Influence isn't the issue. Accountability is." A woman at the end of the table spoke up. "The inspections on Maple Street were fast-tracked." "That much is true." Daniel turned toward her. "By whom?" She hesitated. "By people who assumed no one would push back." Silence filled the room. It wasn't hostile. It was uncomfortable. The kind that came when something unspoken was finally close to the surface. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said. "Those inspections stop. Not permanently. Correctly. With notice. With representation. With someone there who understands what's at stake." "And if the city refuses?" someone asked. Daniel didn't raise his voice. "Then the city explains why." By midday, the men with the clipboard were gone. The truck pulled away without fanfare, leaving only tire marks and a street full of people who didn't quite know what to do with the relief settling into their bones. No one cheered. No one clapped. They just went back inside, slower than before, as if afraid the moment might shatter if they moved too quickly. Annie watched from the bakery window until the street returned to something like normal. Her chest felt lighter, though she didn't know why she trusted it. That afternoon, her mother woke early. She sat at the table with a cup of coffee and listened as Annie recounted everything: the men, the truck, the way Mrs. Alvarez had worried. Her mother closed her eyes briefly. "You did the right thing," she said again, more firmly this time. "But I need you to understand something." Annie looked up. "What?" "People like him," her mother said slowly. "They can help, but they can also leave. What matters is what we do for each other when they're gone." 2-5. Annie nodded. "I know." Her mother studied her, then smiled softly. "You shouldn't have to know that yet." That evening, Daniel stood on Maple Street again. this time in plain daylight. No driver waiting, no phone in his hand. He walked the block from one end to the other, nodding when people looked at him, stopping when someone spoke. A man outside the laundromat eyed him skeptically. "You the reason the city backed off?" Daniel considered the question. "I'm part of it." "Is end." The man snorted. "We'll see how long that lasts." "That's fair," Daniel said. Outside the bakery, Annie spotted him and froze. For a second, she wasn't sure whether to run or wave. He solved the problem by lifting a hand first. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she replied. They stood there, neither quite sure what came next. "They didn't come," Annie said finally. "No," Daniel agreed. "They didn't. Is it because of you?" He shook his head. "It's because people asked questions." Tentated. Annie thought about that. "You helped." "Yes," he said. "But so did you." She frowned. "I just made a phone call." Daniel smiled. "Most things start that way." They walked a few steps together before stopping at the corner. "You know," Daniel said, "there are people who won't like what's happening here." Annie shrugged. "They don't live here." The answer caught him off guard. He laughed softly, then sobered. "No," he said, "they don't." As he turned to leave, Annie called after him. "Daniel?" He paused. "Yes? You said you'd tell me your name if we met again." He smiled. "I did." She nodded, satisfied. "Okay." That night, Maple Street slept a little deeper, not because the danger was gone, but because someone had stood up and said not yet. The first sign of trouble didn't come from Maple Street. It came from downtown. Daniel was halfway through a meeting when his assistant leaned in and slid a tablet across the table. The headline glowed against the dark screen, sharp and unmistakable. "Developer interference stalls. City housing review." Daniel read it once. Then again. The language was careful, almost polite, but the implication was clear. Someone was pushing back, and they had decided not to do it quietly. He set the tablet aside and folded his hands. "So," one of the partners said, leaning back in his chair. Daniel met his gaze. It already began. "This is just the part people notice. You're being painted as sentimental," another added. "Reactive, emotional." Daniel almost smiled. "Those aren't crimes." "No," the partner agreed. "But they're weaknesses. In our world," Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought of Annie's voice on the phone, of the way she'd said, "It feels like something." He wondered how many times he'd ignored that feeling in himself because it didn't come with data attached. "We'll respond," he said finally, "with facts. And if that's not enough, then we respond with consistency." The meeting moved on, but the shift remained. Daniel could feel it, the way you felt pressure change before a storm. On Maple Street, Annie learned about the article from Mrs. Alvarez, who waved a folded newspaper like a flag as Annie passed by on her way home. "They're talking about some big shot messing with the city," she said. "That your friend?" Annie frowned. "Daniel?" "Daniel?" Mrs. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. "You know him by name now?" Annie nodded. "He told me." Mrs. Alvarez huffed. "Must be nice." Annie didn't like the way she said it. "He helped," she said quietly. "So did a lot of people," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "Just remember that." "Oh." Annie walked the rest of the way home thinking about that. Remember that. She wasn't sure what exactly she was supposed to remember, only that things felt heavier than they had a few days ago. Inside the apartment, her mother sat at the table with the newspaper open, the same headline circled in pen. "Mom?" Annie said. Her mother looked up. "I saw. Is it bad?" Her mother considered her words carefully. "It means people are paying attention." "That's good," Annie said. Her mother smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Later that afternoon, Daniel returned to Maple Street, this time with no intention of being seen. He wore a baseball cap low over his eyes and kept his hands in his pockets as he walked past the bakery. The help wanted sign was gone. The window held a new notice instead. "Community meeting tonight. All welcome." He stopped. Inside, chairs had been arranged in uneven rows. The bakery owner was setting out coffee in paper cups. People trickled in, tentative but curious. No one noticed Daniel slip into a seat near the back. The meeting wasn't dramatic. No speeches, no shouting, just questions, concerns. A woman worried about her rent, a man angry about being ignored for years, a teacher asking about the school down the block. Daniel listened. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor near her mother's chair, drawing quietly. When she looked up, she spotted Daniel in the back. Her eyes widened. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just looked at him, as if checking that he was really there. He nodded once. As the meeting wound down, someone asked the question that had been hanging in the air all evening. So what happens now? The bakery owner glanced around, then shrugged. Now we keep showing up. A murmur of agreement followed. Not loud, not triumphant, but real. Daniel left before the meeting ended. Outside, the air was cool, the streetlights just beginning to hum. He leaned against the brick wall for a moment, listening to the voices inside rise and fall together. This was the part no report ever captured. Back at home, Annie finished her drawing and tugged at her mother's sleeve. He was there. Her mother frowned. Who? Daniel. Her mother looked toward the door, then back at Annie. Did he say anything? Annie shook her head. He listened. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. That matters. That night, Daniel stood in his office again. The city spread out below him. The article had already spawned opinions, messages, warnings. His phone buzzed and buzzed until he turned it face down. He picked up a pen and wrote 2 words on a yellow legal pad. Stay consistent. He underlined them twice. Justice, he was learning, wasn't just about stepping in. It was about staying when stepping back would be easier. On Maple Street, Annie taped her newest drawing to the wall above her bed. This one had many people under the same umbrella. It was too small for all of them, but they were trying anyway. She lay down and stared at it, feeling tired in a good way. Outside, the city shifted and argued and pushed back. Inside, a quiet decision held. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, scattered across days, disguised as reasonable concerns and polite warnings. Daniel felt it in the emails that grew longer and colder, in the calls that started with friendly jokes and ended with pointed silences. He felt it most in the meetings where people stopped meeting his eyes. By the end of the week, Maple Street had become a problem with a name. Your name, one advisor said, tapping a pen against a notepad. It's being framed as personal. Daniel nodded. It is personal. That's the problem. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. No, the problem is pretending it isn't. Across town, Annie sat on the front steps with Marcus, watching the late afternoon lights slide down the buildings. He was quieter than usual, his foot tracing patterns in the dust. My mom's scared, he said finally. Annie nodded. Mine too. They say when people get mad enough, they don't stop, Marcus added. Annie thought of Daniel's face at the meeting. The way he hadn't spoken but hadn't left either. Some people don't stop helping, she said. Marcus shrugged. We'll see. That evening, Daniel received the call he had been half expecting. It came from a number he knew well, one he hadn't heard from since before the rain. Daniel, the voice said, smooth and familiar. We need to talk. 18's to way. He closed his office door and sat down. I thought we already had. This is different, the man on the other end replied. You're creating friction. By asking questions? By choosing sides. Daniel looked out the window at the city, its lights blinking on as dusk settled. I chose a street. There was a soft laugh. You always were sentimental. Daniel didn't smile. And you always underestimated what that means. The line went quiet for a moment. When the voice returned, it was colder. You should be careful. There are projects riding on your goodwill. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the phone. Are you threatening me? I'm advising you, the voice said. Step back. Let the process work. Daniel ended the call without replying. For the first time since the night of the rain, anger flared sharp and unmistakable in his chest. Not loud, focused. The kind that came when lines were crossed quietly. At home, Annie helped her mother fold laundry. The rhythm of it was comforting: fold, stack, repeat. Her mother moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if each shirt carried weight beyond its fabric. "Mom?" Annie asked. "Are you mad at him?" Her mother glanced up. "Who?" "Daniel." Her mother paused. "No," she said. "I'm cautious." "Why?" "Because when people push back against powerful things, the powerful things push back harder." Annie considered that.
What do we do?
"But if nobody pushes, nothing changes." "Is not example." Her mother smiled, tired but proud. "You sound older, every day." Annie wrinkled her nose. "I don't want to be old. I just want things to be fair." Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "So do I." The next morning, the bakery owner found a notice taped crookedly to her door. It wasn't official looking. No seals, no logos, just words printed too neatly to be handwritten. "Lease review pending. Expect contact." She stared at it for a long moment, then pulled it down and folded it carefully. When Annie arrived later that afternoon, she found the woman sitting at the counter, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "They're trying again," the woman said. Annie swallowed. "What do we do?" The woman looked at her. "We show up." Same as before. That night, Daniel returned to Maple Street again. This time openly. No cap. No attempt at anonymity. He walked past the bakery just as the owner was locking up. She stopped short when she saw him. "You," she said, not unkindly. "Me," he replied. "May I?" She hesitated, then unlocked the door again and let him inside. The chairs were stacked now, the warmth replaced by the quiet after effort. "They're leaning on you," she said, not needing explanation. "Yes," Daniel answered. "They'll lean harder." "I know." She studied him, searching for something. "Why are you still here?" Daniel thought of the umbrella, of the phone call in the night, of the line he'd written to himself. "Because leaving would be easier," he said. She laughed softly. "That's the worst reason. And the best one." They talked for a while, about nothing and everything, about how the neighborhood had changed, about what stayed. When Daniel finally stepped back outside, the street was nearly empty. Annie watched him from her window, the curtain barely pulled aside. She saw him stop beneath the awning, just for a moment, and look up at the crack. He didn't touch it this time. He just stood there, as if measuring something invisible. Back in his office later, Daniel opened a new file on his computer. Not Maple Street. Not redevelopment. Community partnership proposal. He began to type. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't satisfy everyone. It would be challenged, probably loudly, but it would exist. Justice, he was learning, wasn't a single stand. It was a series of decisions made when no one was watching, followed by the courage to let them be seen. On Maple Street, Annie fell asleep with her drawing still taped above her bed. In the picture, the umbrella had grown bigger. Still imperfect. Still stretched, but it was holding. The proposal didn't stay quiet for long. By the time Daniel arrived at his office the next morning, 3 different news outlets had requested comment, and his assistant's expression had shifted from concern to something closer to disbelief. "They leaked it," she said, holding up her tablet. "Or parts of it." Daniel skimmed the headline. "Developer seeks community veto power in urban projects." He exhaled slowly. "They're calling it radical," she added. "Risky. Some are saying you're undermining the market." Daniel looked up at her. "Are they saying it won't work?" She hesitated. "No. They're saying it will change things." He nodded. "That's the point." On Maple Street, change arrived more quietly. Annie noticed it in small ways first. The city truck that didn't come back. The clipboard men who stayed gone. The way Mrs. Alvarez laughed a little louder when she told stories on the stoop. The bakery owner started putting out an extra chair again, just in case someone wanted to sit. But there were other changes too. A man Annie didn't recognize stood across the street one afternoon, pretending to check his phone while watching the bakery door. When Annie looked back a second time, he was still there. That evening, her mother locked the door with more care than usual. "Is something wrong?" Annie asked. Her mother hesitated. "People notice when things slow down," she said, "especially when they were counting on speed." "Like the rain?" Annie asked. Her mother smiled faintly. "Like that." The next day, Daniel sat in a meeting that felt more like a trial. The room was fuller than usual. Legal counsel, communications, risk assessment. Words like exposure and precedent circled the table like cautious birds. "You're tying our hands," someone said. "I'm tying our conscience to our hands," Daniel replied. "That's not how business works." Daniel leaned forward. "That's how it should." The room went quiet, not angry, uneasy. Afterward, Daniel didn't go back to his office. He went to Maple Street instead. This time, he brought papers. The bakery owner cleared a space on the counter as Daniel spread them out: maps, outlines, timelines written in plain language. "This isn't a promise," he said. "It's a framework for people to say yes or no." She scanned the pages slowly. "You know they'll fight this." "Yes," Daniel said. "And if you lose?" Daniel looked around the bakery, the scuffed floor, the chipped counter, the window that caught afternoon light just right. "Then at least the fight will be honest." Annie sat at the small table nearby, coloring. She listened, without pretending not to. "Can I ask something?" she said suddenly. Daniel looked over. "Of course. Why do people get mad when they don't get their way?" she asked. He smiled ruefully. "Because they confuse getting their way with being right." Endless. Annie considered that. "That's silly." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "It is." Outside, a car idled a little too long at the curb. Daniel noticed. The bakery owner noticed too. Their eyes met briefly. "You should be careful," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I am." That night, Annie dreamed of umbrellas. Not one, but many. Overlapping, patched together from different colors and shapes. They didn't match. They didn't fit perfectly. But they covered more ground than a single one ever could. She woke before dawn, the image lingering like a thought she didn't want to lose. The next morning, the city council announced a public hearing. Maple Street redevelopment. Community comment invited. The words were small, easy to miss, buried halfway down a page. But on Maple Street, they landed like thunder. "They want us to talk," Marcus said, eyes wide. "They want us to listen," Mrs. Alvarez corrected. The bakery owner taped the notice to her window, right where everyone could see it. That afternoon, Daniel stood in his office watching rain begin to gather again. Light at first, then steadier. His phone buzzed with another call. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of his proposal draft. No decision about a community should be made without the community. He underlined it once. On Maple Street, Annie held her old umbrella up to the rain and smiled. This time, it wasn't just for one person. The public hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening. The notice had been taped to the bakery window for 2 days before Annie realized what it meant. Not just that people could talk, but that they would have to. Out loud, in front of others. That scared grown-ups more than children. On Maple Street, preparation took the form of conversations that lingered longer than usual. People stopped on the sidewalk instead of waving and moving on. Mrs. Alvarez brought out folding chairs. The bakery owner brewed extra coffee and left the door open even when the air turned cold. Annie watched it all with careful attention. Her mother filled out a form at the kitchen table, crossing out answers and rewriting them more than once. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was focused in the way Annie recognized the way people looked when they were about to speak up after a long time of staying quiet. "Mom," Annie asked, "what are you going to say?" Her mother looked up. "The truth." "What truth?" "That this place is our life," she said. "Not an investment. Not a phase." Annie nodded. That sounded right. Across town, Daniel prepared differently. He read every version of the proposal again, not to change it, but to remind himself where it could be misunderstood. He met with lawyers who warned him about setting expectations, with advisors who urged him to soften the language, with colleagues who suggested he send a representative instead of showing up himself. He declined all of it. "If I'm asking people to stand up," he said, "I don't get to sit down." The night of the hearing arrived with a light drizzle, the kind that didn't soak you but made sure you felt it. Annie held her umbrella tightly as she walked with her mother toward the community center. The building was old, its paint chipped, its windows clouded with years of breath and weather. Inside, the room was already half full. Annie had never seen so many of her neighbors in one place at the same time. Some stood along the walls, Others sat stiffly in folding chairs, hands clasped, eyes alert. At the front, a long table waited with microphones and name placards. Daniel sat near the end of it. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a dark jacket and an open collar. He looked smaller here, Annie thought. Not weaker, just closer. When he saw Annie, his expression softened for a brief second. He nodded. She nodded back. The meeting began with rules, time limits, procedures, language about respect. Annie didn't listen closely to that part. She watched the people instead, the way shoulders tensed, the way breaths were held. The first speaker was a city official who spoke carefully, as if each word had been approved in advance. She talked about opportunity, about growth, about balancing interests. Then the floor opened. For a moment, no one moved. Annie felt the silence stretch, thin and uncomfortable. She glanced at her mother, who was staring straight ahead, jaw set. Then Mrs. Alvarez stood. She didn't go to the microphone. She didn't need to. "I've lived on Maple Street for 42 years, she said, her voice steady. "I raised 2 children there, buried 1 husband, watched 3 stores come and go. If you want to talk about balance, start by telling me how many years I'm worth." The room shifted. Applause didn't come right away. People were too busy breathing again. One by one, others stood. The bakery owner, a teacher, a man who worked nights and slept days. Each spoke in their own way, some stumbling, some fierce, all unmistakably present. Annie listened, heart pounding, as if the words were stepping stones across something deep. Finally, her mother stood. She walked to the microphone slowly, deliberately. Annie watched her hands grip the edge of the podium, then relax. "My daughter asked me the other day if fairness was real," her mother said. "I didn't know how to answer her. I still don't. But I do know this. If decisions are made without us, then fairness doesn't even get a chance." She paused, swallowing. "We don't need saving. We need listening." When she sat down, Annie felt something warm spread through her chest. Pride, maybe, or recognition. Then Daniel stood. The room quieted. Not out of respect exactly, but anticipation. People wanted to know what he would say now that they had spoken. He didn't move to the microphone right away. "I didn't come here to convince you," he said. "You don't need convincing. I came here to put my name next to what you're saying." He looked around the room, meeting eyes without flinching. "I have power," he continued. "I won't pretend otherwise. But power that doesn't listen becomes pressure. And pressure eventually breaks things that didn't need breaking." "Oh, way." Someone in the back muttered agreement. "I don't know how this ends," Daniel said. "I only know that if it ends without your voices in the record, then it ends wrong." He stepped back. That was it. No applause followed. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because something else had taken hold. Something quieter, heavier, ownership. The meeting ended without a vote, without a resolution. But when people filed out into the rain, they did so together, talking, arguing, planning. Outside, Annie opened her umbrella and stood beside Daniel as he waited for his car. "You did good," she said. "So did you," he replied. "I didn't talk. You showed up," he said. "That counts." She smiled at that. As the car pulled up, Daniel hesitated. "Annie," he said, "whatever happens next, this doesn't stop here." She nodded. "I know." The rain fell softly around them. Not a storm this time, just enough to remind everyone that the air was alive and that things, once stirred, didn't settle easily again. The morning after the hearing, Maple Street felt different again. Not quieter, not calmer, just awake. Annie noticed it when she walked to school. People nodded at each other with purpose instead of habit. Conversations didn't trail off when someone new approached. They widened, as if there were room now. Even the air felt sharper, cleaner. Like something had been named that had been weighing on everyone without a word. At the corner, Mrs. Alvarez waved a folded flyer. "They're forming a committee," she said. "Residents, business owners, parents." Annie blinked. "What kind of committee?" "The kind that doesn't wait to be invited," Mrs. Alvarez replied. At school, Annie's teacher asked the class to write about something important that had happened recently. Most kids wrote about birthdays or soccer games. Annie drew again instead. This time, she drew a room with people standing up one by one. No faces, just outlines. At the front of the room, she drew a long table, but instead of chairs behind it, she left it empty. After school, she went straight to the bakery. The chairs were back out, more of them this time. The owner was on the phone, speaking fast, her free hand gesturing even though no one was watching. Yes. Tonight? No. Not just business owners. Everyone. Yes. I'll make more coffee. She hung up and looked at Annie, eyes bright with exhaustion. They're coming, she said. Who? Annie asked. Everybody. Across town, Daniel sat with his legal team, the mood taut. They're organizing, one of the lawyers said. This is becoming visible. Daniel nodded. Good. You understand the risks, another asked. Public sentiment is unpredictable. So is silence, Daniel replied. His phone buzzed with another message he didn't answer. He had learned something over the past weeks. Urgency could be useful, but not everything urgent deserved immediate attention. Instead, he stood, picked up his coat, and left the office. When he arrived on Maple Street, dusk was settling in. The bakery glowed again, its windows fogged, the sound of voices spilling out onto the sidewalk. Daniel paused before going in. He didn't want to dominate the room. He wanted to witness it. Inside, the space was crowded but orderly. People stood shoulder to shoulder, cups in hand, voices overlapping without drowning each other out. There was no microphone this time, no agenda printed neatly at the door. Just a chalkboard with 3 words written across it in uneven letters. What do we need? Answers were being added beneath it. Housing security. Schools. Jobs that didn't disappear overnight. Respect. Daniel leaned against the wall, unnoticed for a moment. He watched as Annie climbed onto a chair to reach the chalkboard and added something of her own. Her tongue peeking out in concentration, she wrote slowly, time. Someone laughed softly behind her. That's a good one. Annie shrugged. Everything needs time. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. The discussion that followed wasn't smooth. People interrupted, disagreed, changed their minds halfway through sentences, but no one left. That, Daniel realized, was the difference. In all his years of meetings, leaving had always been the quiet threat. Here, staying was the point. When someone finally noticed him and made room, Daniel shook his head. I'm just listening tonight, he said, and he did. He listened to anger that didn't ask permission to exist, to fear that didn't apologize for itself, to hope spoken cautiously, as if it might vanish if named too loudly. Later, outside, Annie walked with him toward the corner where their paths usually split. Are you tired? She asked. Yes, Daniel said honestly. Good, tired, or bad tired? He smiled. Good tired. She nodded, approving. That means you did something. Well, they stopped beneath the awning again. The crack above them was still there, dark and familiar. Do you think they'll stop trying? Annie asked. Daniel looked up at the broken concrete, then back down at her. No, he said, but I think they'll have to try differently now. That's better, Annie said. Yes, Daniel agreed. It is. That night, Daniel returned home later than usual. He didn't turn on the lights right away. He stood in the quiet, thinking of the room full of people who had decided to stay present even when it was uncomfortable. He opened his notebook and wrote a new line beneath the old ones. Justice doesn't arrive. It's built. On Maple Street, Annie fell asleep quickly. Her dreams crowded with voices that didn't scare her anymore. They overlapped and echoed, but they didn't drown each other out. They made something like music. Outside, rain began again, light and patient, not a storm, just enough to keep things growing. The decision came quietly, the way most lasting things did. It wasn't announced with headlines or urgent alerts. It arrived in the form of an email sent late on a Tuesday evening, buried between routine updates and scheduling notices. Daniel read it twice before letting himself believe what it said. Maple Street redevelopment, revised status, community partnership framework accepted, no displacement clause adopted. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Accepted didn't mean finished. It didn't mean safe forever. but it meant something fundamental had shifted. A door that had never been meant to open had cracked wide enough for voices to pass through. The next morning, Maple Street buzzed with the news before the bakery even opened. Mrs. Alvarez knocked on doors she hadn't knocked on in years. Someone chalked a message on the sidewalk near the corner. The bakery owner taped a new sign inside the window, handwritten this time. Meeting tonight. Next steps. Annie read it twice, then once more for certainty. At school, she couldn't sit still. When the bell rang at the end of the day, she was out the door before her teacher finished the sentence. She ran most of the way home, umbrella banging against her leg with every step. Her mother was at the table when she burst in, reading the same email on her phone. "Mom," Annie said, breathless. "It says they listened." Her mother looked up and smiled. The kind of smile that didn't come often but stayed a long time when it did. "It says they started to." That night, the bakery was too small. People spilled onto the sidewalk, cups of coffee in hand, laughter and raised voices mixing freely. Someone brought a radio. Someone else brought a box of old folding chairs. It wasn't organized, and no one tried to make it so. Daniel arrived quietly, as he often did now. No one announced him. No one needed to. Annie spotted him near the back, speaking with the bakery owner. She made her way over, weaving between legs and chairs. "It worked," she said. Daniel smiled. "Parts of it did. That's enough," Annie said firmly. He laughed softly. "You might be right." As the evening wore on, plans began to take shape. Committees were named. Dates were circled. Responsibilities were shared instead of assigned. Daniel listened, offering clarification when asked, stepping back when he wasn't needed. At one point, Mrs. Alvarez tapped a spoon against her cup to get attention. The noise cut through the room just enough. "We should thank him," she said, nodding toward Daniel. "He didn't have to do this." A murmur of agreement followed. Daniel raised a hand slightly. "Please don't," he said. "This doesn't belong to me." Mrs. Alvarez studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. You clapping too, Len." Annie watched the exchange, something thoughtful settling behind her eyes. Later, when the crowd thinned and the chairs were stacked again, Annie walked with Daniel to the corner, the way she often did now. "Is it over?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, but it's different." "Different is good," Annie said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." They stood beneath the awning one last time, the place where everything had begun. The crack above them was still there, unchanged. Some things didn't need fixing to be meaningful. "You know," Daniel said, "I almost didn't stop that night." Annie looked up at him. "But you did." "Yes," he said. "Because you were there." She considered that. "I think you would have stopped anyway." Daniel smiled, touched. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." A light rain began to fall, barely more than mist. Annie opened her umbrella out of habit, angling it between them. Daniel didn't protest. They stood there for a moment, sharing the small circle of shelter, watching the street glow under the lamps. Cars passed, people hurried by. Life continued, indifferent and persistent. Across the city, decisions were already being challenged. Lawyers were drafting responses. Critics were sharpening their words. None of that reached Maple Street just then. What reached it was something else. Relief, momentum, the quiet confidence of people who had been seen. Annie closed her umbrella and slung it over her shoulder. "I have to go," she said. "My mom's waiting." "Of course," Daniel replied. She took a few steps, then turned back. "Daniel?" "Yes. Thank you for stopping." He shook his head gently. "Thank you for asking." She smiled and ran off toward her building, her footsteps light against the pavement. Daniel stayed a moment longer, then walked away in the opposite direction, his phone buzzing in his pocket with problems that would keep coming. He welcomed them now, because he knew where he would stand when they did. On Maple Street, the lights stayed on a little later that night, not because anyone was afraid of the dark, but because they were no longer waiting for permission to be seen. The rain returned the way it always had without asking permission. It began just before dawn, a steady whisper against Maple Street that carried more memory than force. Annie woke to the sound and lay still, listening, the way she always did now. Rain no longer meant only cold or hurry. It meant beginnings. She got out of bed quietly and taped one last drawing to the wall. This one was different. No umbrellas. No rain. Just a street with lights on in every window. Her mother stirred as Annie padded into the kitchen. "You're up early," her mother said, rubbing her eyes. "I wanted to see the rain," Annie replied. Her mother smiled and poured coffee, the familiar smell filling the room. "It's going to be a long day." "They're all long," Annie said. "But not the same." Her mother studied her for a moment, then nodded. "No," she said. "Not the same." By mid-morning, Maple Street was awake and moving. Not rushing. Moving with intention. The bakery opened early, the bell chiming again and again as people came in not just for bread, but to talk. Flyers were taped to windows announcing workshops, meetings, classes. Nothing grand, just plans that had places to land. Daniel arrived just after noon. No driver this time. No jacket, either. He walked the length of the street slowly, hands in his pockets, nodding to people who now recognized him not as an outsider, but as a participant. Someone handed him a cup of coffee without asking. He accepted it with a quiet thank you. At the corner, he stopped beneath the awning. The crack was still there. He looked up at it and smiled, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. Some flaws marked where you had been. Some reminded you why you stopped. Annie spotted him from the bakery doorway. "Daniel," she called. He turned, surprised, then smiled. "Hi." She ran over, her steps light. "It's raining again." "I noticed," he said. She opened her umbrella without thinking, holding it between them. It was still small, still frayed, still perfectly enough. "You don't need to," he said gently. "I know," Annie replied, "but I want to." They stood there for a moment, watching rain trace lines down the street. "Are you leaving?" Annie asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not today. Not ever," she pressed. He considered the question. "I'll be around," he said. "And when I'm not, others will be." Annie nodded, satisfied with that answer. Later, the city released a formal statement. Words like pilot program and precedent appeared again. But this time, they carried a different weight. The bakery owner read it aloud to a small crowd, her voice steady. "It means we stay," she said simply. No one cheered. They hugged. They laughed. Someone cried without hiding it. That afternoon, Daniel sat at a folding table with residents, signing papers that didn't feel like contracts so much as commitments. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was plain. "I can't promise there won't be fights," he said. "There will be. We know," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "We've been fighting our whole lives." Daniel nodded. "Then we'll fight smarter." As evening settled in, the rain slowed, then stopped. Maple Street glowed under streetlights, wet pavement reflecting windows full of life. Children ran past puddles. Someone played music from an open window. The bakery stayed open late, the smell of bread carrying farther than usual. Daniel walked Annie home. At her door, she stopped and looked up at him. "Do you think people change?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But not all at once." She thought about that. "I think they change when they stop." He smiled. "I think you're right." Inside, Annie's mother waited, arms crossed, but her expression was softer now. "Thank you," she said to Daniel. "Not formally, not carefully. Just honestly. You don't owe me anything," he replied. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying it." Daniel nodded and stepped back into the street. He walked away slowly, not because he was tired, but because he no longer felt chased by what came next. The city would test this. People would argue. Systems would resist. But something had already been rewritten, not in policy alone, in habit, in memory, in the simple knowledge that someone could stop in the rain, and that stopping mattered. Upstairs, Annie climbed into bed and stared at her drawing one last time before sleep took her. Outside, the street was quiet, but not empty. It held the quiet of people who knew they belonged. Across town, Daniel stood at his window, watching clouds break apart, stars peeking through. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't write another note. For the first time in a long while, he let the moment stand. True wealth, he understood now, wasn't counted, it was shared. And sometimes, it arrived disguised as a small umbrella, held steady by a child who didn't know she was changing the shape of things, only that no one should be left alone in the rain. This story reminds us that real change often begins with a small, human choice. Justice is not always born in offices, policies, or power. It starts when someone decides to see another person and act with compassion. A single act of kindness, offered without knowing who deserves it or what it might cost, can ripple outward and challenge systems that rely on silence and indifference. The story teaches that dignity is not granted by status or wealth, but revealed through empathy, courage, and the willingness to stop, listen, and stand with others, especially when it would be easier to walk away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.